All right, welcome. Ambawashte. Chazemi tawa ni sakumaki makiapi. Tobeka wakwa enwati. Welcome everyone to our first Envisioning Health and Healthcare in the Future of Black Liberation and Indigenous Sovereignty. We are so happy that you are here for this wonderful historic event for the American Indian Cancer Foundation. We just wanted to let you all know that we will be recording and there is closed captioning available. Captions will be available through the Zoom. You can choose to activate the captions by going to the bottom of your Zoom window and clicking on the arrow to the right of the closed caption button. You can make the captions appear as subtitles within the Zoom window or as a live transcript in the chat bar to the right of the Zoom window. If the live transcript option is selected, the entire transcript can be saved by clicking Save Transcript in the bottom right corner, and we'll make sure to include these instructions in the chat. At any time during the webinar, if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box. Also, at the end of the webinar, we will be sending out an evaluation link. So we would love for you to please include that and fill that out. It's also important that we would love to know who you are and where you're all coming in and calling in from. So if you can include your name, your ancestral tribal lineage, the ancestral lands that you reside on, as well as the organization that you're working with and who you're dedicating this work and what you do this, who you do this work for. So we're really happy you're here, and we're going to turn it over to the American Indian Cancer Foundation's Chief Executive Officer, Melissa Buffalo.
Thank you, Coco. How midakiapi ampetuashte, Melissa Buffalo imachiapie. Welcome to Envisioning Health and Healthcare in a Future of Black Liberation and Indigenous Sovereignty webinar series. As the CEO of the American Indian Cancer Foundation, with the responsibility of representing a national nonprofit that works with communities across the country, we take this momentous event as the opportunity to provide a platform to discuss our unique and shared experiences and movements across Indian country. We know that healthcare is more than just taking care of our physical bodies. It's also caring for our mental, spiritual, and emotional well-being, as well as our connection to our communities and the earth. With that, we must continue to elevate and include our Black and Native relatives into conversations surrounding health, equity, and community relationships. I would like to share our working land and labor acknowledgement as we introduce the importance of having these conversations. The American Indian Cancer Foundation is located on the traditional lands of the Dakota people in Mbede, Ota, Otue, Minnesota, or the present-day city of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Here at ACAF, we strive to live out the values of balance, sustainability, respect for all living things, interrelatedness, non-linearity, and lifeways rooted in culture. We acknowledge the Dakota people's continuous contributions, past, present, and future to our world. We give thanks to our earth relatives for its generosity of life. Comment where you are from and whose ancestral lands you are tuning in from. You can text 1-907-312-5085 to find out whose ancestral homelands you reside on. You can learn more about the Dakota names for the place in Minnesota from Marlena Miles, and I believe they will link that in the chat. Labor acknowledgement. We acknowledge the history of violent enslavement and exploitation across the United States, including the enslavement of African people and their descendants. Their labor, bodies, and energies were and are exploited for generations to help establish and maintain the United States, including the economy and culture. There are no words to fully encompass the violent history on Native land. We acknowledge the relatives who did not survive and external gratitude to our Black and Indigenous ancestors. We also acknowledge our Earth relatives in these interactions, knowing that as generous as our planet is, that the violence here was not what it hoped or hoped for its children. We are committed to doing our best to honor our relatives and ancestors through our lives in hopes of a better future for our descendants. Black and Native people continue to survive amidst ongoing genocide, including through displacement, dispossession, and exploitation. These issues are directly connected to the health disparities and burdens of our relatives, including the earth. There are around 9.7 million Native community members and 46.9 million Black community members across Indian country, according to the 2020 census. Of those who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, 5.9 million people identified with another race group in 2020, which speaks to the intersectional identities that our relatives have. The intersecting histories and current realities of Black liberation, Indigenous sovereignty have been profoundly impacted by that legacy of ancestors who resisted various systems of oppression, as well as by relatives who are currently co-creating the future. We want to acknowledge that understanding our histories, which are also our creation stories, is a living process of becoming. While this is where we are today with our land and labor acknowledgements, we will continue to review, learn, and adapt as part of ACAF's focus on equity. We are thankful for the contributions that our relatives and ancestors have made to get us to this day, where we are able to be together in community and solidarity. As part of ACAF's commitment to our communities and health equity, we look forward to building relationships with community members and external partners in order to address intersecting cancer burdens. We welcome you to reach out with questions and discussions about our living acknowledgements. Lastly, as we at ACAF, we strive to expand advocacy and awareness for cancer to tribal and Indigenous communities, as well as other stakeholders. As Indigenous communities and peoples, we know we have a responsibility to our relatives and the next generations to continue creating a future where Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty are realized. We know that many of our leaders and communities have done so much already. We are so thankful for their commitment to our relatives and excited to have some of them here today. This webinar series gives us the opportunity to learn about the opportunities that we all have to create this reality as advocates and leaders within our own circles. This includes honoring the ancestral work that these leaders are doing in health equity for Black and Native communities. We ask you to attend this webinar with an open mind and, more importantly, a commitment on how to best serve Black and Native communities. With that, we are pleased to welcome today's facilitators. We would love for you all to introduce yourselves. Pilamia, Kitabi.
So we're going to have our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start it off with Christine.
Bonjour, Jawanuga Nungikwe, Anishinaabe Indigenous Cause, Christine Smith, Chimook Indigenous Cause, Gawa Bugana Kagan Dunjaba, Red Lake Nation Dunjaba. Forgive me if I said anything wrong. I'm still teaching myself Ojibwe. My name is Christine Smith. My ancestry, I'm a lineal descendant of Red Lake and White Earth Nation, and really glad to be here today. Miigwech.
Natasha?
Thank you, Coco. Thank you, everyone, for ACAF for having me. My name is Natasha Phelps. My pronouns she, her, hers. I serve as the Director of Equity Center Policies at the Center for Black Health and Equity. We are a nonprofit organization based in North Carolina. And we work to advance all issues pertaining to Black health, to advance the health of Black people in the United States and global diaspora. Of course, working on anti-Blackness and other forms of racism in all forms, especially systemic racism. That's what we're going to be talking about today, right? This issue that affects us similarly in this intersectional place. But I am not Native or American Indian, but I do live on the traditional homelands of the Dakota people, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And my lineage, I'm a Black woman. My ancestral lineage is African. Of course, I unfortunately don't know exactly where, but West African and Irish. So thank you again for having me.
Tegan?
Hi, everybody. I'm very grateful to be here today. My name is Tegan Carr. I am a medical student, writer, activist, and researcher. I am a slavery descended African-American descendant of slavery, and also of Seminole heritage from Northern Florida.
Thank you. Tegan, Misha?
Bonjour, hello everyone. My name is Misha LaPlante. I am the Cancer Programs Manager for the American Indian Cancer Foundation. I am really excited to be here with all of you today.
Thank you so much. We're so happy that you all are here. And now we're going to turn it over to Tegan to do our opening blessing for us.
Thank you, Coco. So for this, I was thinking we could just do a little grounding and meditation exercise and feel thankful and present in ourselves. So I invite you to close your eyes if you want to, but you don't have to. And we're going to start out by just breathing. And you can turn your video off if it's more comfortable for you. So breathing and finding a rhythm that's comfortable and natural to you. There's no right or wrong way. Just let your breath find a rhythm like waves on a shore, cycling. There's no perfect pace or way to find your breath. There's no perfect tide. And as you ease into that, think about water. Think about waves. Think about how incredible water is, how wonderful, how grateful you are for it. Think about how water can change its shape, that it can be in a different state so that it operates on a different level of nature, even follows different natural laws or defies them on the most basic molecular level, and yet it is still water. And think about how it can be more than one way all at once. It can be everything and still itself. That it can fall or float from the sky and be held to the earth by unseen forces. And it can rise again to the sky. It can become and unbecome. Be grateful to water and allow yourself to feel in awe that everything and everyone that is or will be or ever has been touched by water, and that water always comes back home. And be aware that every drop of water is different. And that imagining, perceiving every drop is too vast. But it's all one water. Imagine yourself as the water and all parts of the water. And imagine the water that is a part of you. And think about where that water has been, where you have been, your connection to your family and your ancestors, and to the earth. And the water that is you is the water that nurtures you. And all the places that it has been and the earth that it's run over. And be thankful to the water. And may we all be like the water that nurtures us, nourishes us, loves us. And may we each see ourselves as precious drops in the ocean and allow ourselves to be fluid, changing, lasting, stronger together. And may we find the ability to be present in everything and to be timeless. And just take a few final breaths to hold that and feel thankful and feel love and feel that you are loved. And you can open your eyes if you haven't already.
Thank you so much, Tegan, for that beautiful grounding. I encourage everybody to take a drink of water and really breathe in those words that Tegan just shared with us as we're going to begin our discussion today. So much gratitude. Thank you. So today we're really excited. We wanted to highlight some of our overall objectives for this webinar today. We really want to describe past and current health disparities along the cancer continuum affecting Black and Native communities. We want to identify health practices and healing perspectives from Black and Native communities. We want to determine actionable steps for community partners and members to address health equity within cancer control, including prevention, treatment, and survivorship. And finally, we would love to envision health and healthcare in a future of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm going to get us kind of started in a conversation or maybe just some history with where ACAF was with this project, and now here we are today. I'm also going to share my screen or try to, and hopefully it comes up as slideshow. Please let me know. Is it slideshow? Great. Thank you. So we are talking about the intersections between Black and Native health disparities today. So ACAF started these conversations back in 2020 and then really had a lot more conversations in 2021. And now here we are in 2022. These conversations were brought on because of the police violence that Minneapolis was experiencing, that our communities, our relatives were experiencing. And so we started to ask ourselves, how can ACAF expand conversations on what does and could healthcare and health look like in a future or creation story of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty? And so we're really grateful to be joined by all of these amazing panelists, as well as all of you relatives who are listening in and having this conversation as part of your own health story and interconnection between one another. So, of course, being a public health institute, we want to talk about cancer and related health disparities that we are seeing. So some of the leading causes of death for the Black community include heart disease, cancer, and COVID-19. We see these same leading causes of death kind of switched up for Native communities, with COVID-19 being at the top, followed by heart disease, and then cancer. Kind of where we see some similarities is between these most diagnosed cancers for Black and Native communities. So those cancers include breast and prostate, lung, and colon cancer. So here we have this image of the cancer continuum, which I think is just a really helpful kind of illustration to understand where these different points of intersection might be, particularly for Black and Native communities, as well as other allies and accomplices who might be able to help kind of boost, uplift these points of intersection where we might make some more traction around these health disparities or inequities that we're seeing. And so for those who don't know, the cancer continuum really starts with the etiology, moves into prevention, detection, diagnosis, treatment, and survivorship. Another reason we want to bring this up is because We are really curious about how we can provide more opportunities or kind of ideas for relatives to get involved with addressing cancer burdens in their own communities. And so most states, all states, I should say, have a cancer plan that outlines goals, objectives, and strategies to address these cancer burdens. And many of them use the Cancer Continuum as kind of a groundwork, a framework for discussing these different pieces. ACAF is actually included in this. So ACAF has our own cancer plan, and we have goals, strategies, objectives laid out like this. We also have a section on health equity and are currently in the revision process and are going to be expanding to include emergency preparedness as well. And so for those who are listening in, if you're not already involved in your state's coalition or in a coalition that is addressing cancer burdens, this is an opportunity both for Native communities as well as Black communities to make sure that we're having conversations in these spaces. I'm sure some of us can relate to the idea that sometimes you're the only person of color walking into the room to actually give a voice to some of these concerns, these issues, these challenges that our relatives are facing. And so it's really important that we are in these spaces. Between both communities, we're seeing common barriers to cancer prevention, screening, and treatment, which are not new to any of us. These include systemic problems that include access to care, neighborhood infrastructure, which can either be the actual setup of the overall city. So that can be related to pollution. It might be related to distance to cancer treatment centers for relatives, that kind of thing. We also know that there's lack of financial mobility due to limited educational resources. And so oftentimes it might just be said that this is educational, or that education is a quote unquote challenge, but it's not just that, it's that there's actually a lack of resources for many of our communities to have those opportunities within education. And so really naming the problem, as we all know, is very, very important. And it's a process of remembering and actually reclaiming what the solutions and challenges are is so important. Kind of related to all of this is a conversation that also needs to be had around data genocide and racial misclassification. So here you can see that it's collectively defined as incorrectly coding individuals' race or ethnicity as a form of erasure of a group of people. So this meaning for overall health disparities is that proper classification or lack of proper classification can really lead to differences in disease prevalence in a population. And if we don't have the correct numbers or a better understanding of what these numbers are, we're not able to dedicate attention, resources, research, and public health programming to the communities, the relatives that actually need them. We have a bit about for cancer health disparities specifically, we see within the Native community that we have the highest racial misclassification of any group, which results in an underestimation of the disease burdens. And those can go unaddressed if we don't have them named specifically. I also want to point out that just due to the history of colonization within this country, there were certain, policies that allowed for our relatives and our ancestors to be identified in ways that they wanted to be identified, or that they weren't allowed to be identified in ways that they wanted to be identified. So that means that the underestimation or the estimation of disease burden might look very different. So for instance, Melissa had named earlier on that there are around 4 to 5 million, I believe, Native people who are biracial or multiracial. And so that number might look even more different based on the history of how our ancestors were given the opportunity to actually embrace who they were, their indigeneity, their Blackness, all of that. And so it's really important to note these things as we're going through, specifically so that if we are showing up in these spaces in the coalition, for instance, that we're having conversations about this. Data surveillance is a huge problem. to making sure that we have the resources that we need, that our communities need. So I'm really excited to hear what more our panelists have to say about some of these topics, and know that it's going to be really, really fruitful. So I'm going to hand it over to Coco now, who's going to start us off with our first question.
Thank you so much, Misha, and we're so excited for this conversation that we've been really planning, and early in our planning stages, several of you mentioned how decolonization and honoring your own personal sovereignty and liberation was really about the reclamation of your mind, body, and spirit, and how that being pivotal to the work that you all do. So we would love to hear from you all. What is your personal connection to this discussion, and what is part of your creation story with sovereignty and liberation, and really what that means to you all?
I don't know if we're in an order, but I'm happy to kick us off. I also forgot to say that I am currently the Director of Equity at Penumbra Theater Center for Racial Healing. So I did not get to say that. But yeah, that's a great question. And it was kind of the first thing I thought of when asked was my own personal journey, because it's connected to the work that I do. And it's the reason for the work that I do. I am 44 years old now, but when I was 18 years old, it was when I really started on my own personal journey for health and wellness. I didn't really have that language for it. I didn't really have any language for it. I knew that something had to change in my life. I was in a very self-destructive state, self-sabotaging state, and I knew something intuitively told me I had to get out of that cycle. And I moved away from where I grew up and away from my family and friends, and kind of went on my own journey. I was told by some folks that I needed to, get some mental health therapy, like that would help me. And so I did. I went down to the local clinic and was like, hey, I'm really struggling. They did that assessment on me and they were like, well, you have anxiety. It's like, great. Gave me some meds. I took it, didn't like it. Went back and did that assessment again. And they said, okay, yeah, you're right. You have depression. And I was like, okay, let's try these meds. So I tried these meds out, was going to therapy, was going to all these groups and everything. And it wasn't working. Like I wasn't feeling it. So I went back for the third time. And this time the psychiatrist said, you have paranoid schizophrenia. And I was shocked. I didn't accept the meds that he was trying to offer me. I walked away and said, for me personally, I said, I'm never going to go down that path again of trying to get some medication. I somehow intuitively knew that because of some of the experiences that I had had in my life, that was why I was struggling emotionally. And I felt in myself that I needed to do certain things. I needed to eat healthy. I needed to exercise. I needed to sing. I needed to separate myself from certain destructive behaviors. These were things that I intuitively started to know. No one told me these things, but they were very intuitive for me. And so I started to follow on that path. And unfortunately, that even in itself, some folks were telling me that, what's telling you to do that, and kind of making it seem like I was crazy for listening to my intuition, listening to myself. Speed up to a few decades later, here I am sitting as a 44-year-old woman, and I've never had a psychotic episode. Actually, I'm probably in the best health that I've ever had in my life. And I understand the need and purpose for Western medicine and that whole system. And had I not followed my own intuition, and had I not been on that path for myself, I wouldn't be where I am today. And it's very much informed the work that I do in wanting to share with others and even systems an alternative path. Yes, there's this Western medicine path, and there's also an alternative path, and really offering people that choice. And that's me decolonizing my own health and sovereignty, and really standing in that sovereignty of saying, I know what's best for me. I trust myself above all else. I can get information can come to me, and I can review that against what I feel within my spirit. and I can decide and choose the path that I'm going to take. And to me, that is sovereignty.
And then I'll just kind of go off what Christine was just saying. For me, it was, you know, I'm a lawyer, and so I've been through, you know, like a lot of people have, you know, traditional K through 12 school, college, and then law school. When I was in law school, I think I was really realizing, as I kind of always inherently had throughout my entire education, that there was conflict between how I felt I needed to move and experience life and what was expected of me and what I needed to do in order to be, you know, successful and safe, and all the things you have to do in order to just survive in the society that we live in the world that we live in. And, you know, I didn't understand really what to do with that. And so I just kind of leaned into that, which I think many of us do, especially those of us who decide to go into these spaces that are, you know, very white dominated spaces. And that includes public health as well. But, you know, just deciding to really lean into it and, you know, really kind of leaning into it, but taking on a different veil. So really thinking about, you know, placing expectations on myself to fix and heal these like broken systems that we have on an individual level. And so I'm placing not only a lot of responsibility and perfectionism on myself to succeed in these traditional ways, in law, in policy, in whatever, but then also that I needed to, because I'm aware of all this, and I reject it, even though I'm leaning into it, because I need to survive. I still want to be successful. I still don't want to, you know, be on the other end of what damage and violence comes from that. I'm still doing it, but then I also, because I recognize what it is, need to lean into fixing and healing it. And, you know, I think a lot of people who decide to, you know, decolonize their mind and spirit and work towards a decolonization of our world, once you start doing it, you understand it's not like it's not peaceful. It's very violent as well, because it was a violent process to begin with. And those who uphold colonization and those who uphold white supremacy and anti-Blackness and other forms of racism, those are the tools are violent. And so it's not easier to, you know, to decide that you're going to, you know, lean into learning how to decolonize your mind and your spirit and the way that you go about doing things. And it's really, really difficult when you are in a situation where you have to engage in these like really white-centered colonial processes in order to make that happen. And so I feel like I was running myself into the ground throughout my entire career. I mean, still to this day, like I'm really, I'm still figuring it out. You know, as Christine was saying, you know, this is a process, a journey for me. But there are some things that I learned on my process that made it easier and actually more genuine for me, the process. So just the expectations I was putting on myself to really heal and fix these broken systems that we see, you know, I was placing these expectations on others as well. You know, this idea of, you know, if you're going to be an activist, if you're going to be an advocate, then you gotta, you know, go, run yourself into the ground, acknowledging that, you know, that we are all exhausted. And, you know, I think that's the intersectionality in this discussion, the undercurrent of these issues when we're talking about Black health and Native health. And I just want to say also to Black Natives, you know, when it comes to talking about Black health, we really want to make sure that we're acknowledging our Black Native brothers, sisters, and other family members. So, you know, it's this idea of just acknowledging that the process in which I'm engaging in my work is not, it doesn't align with how I want to exist. And so what can I do to slowly dismantle that in my own life? And that's been a real process for me. And so I think the biggest thing is just to acknowledge the fact that I can't do all of it myself, which perfectionism I think is really hard to overcome. But at least it's okay if you feel all the feelings from not doing a good enough job or feeling like you could do more, but at least to acknowledge that those feelings are the results of a violent colonial white supremacist world. it does do something. And so to me, that is what I have found to be a tool that's been very useful. So I'm not trying to take on yet another burden of trying to change who I am, but just to acknowledge that the feelings that I have aren't just mine because of who I am, but it's a response to, this violent system that we have been put upon us, with capitalism and colonialism and all of that. So I think that's the biggest thing for me, the lessons I've learned in my career. And I think it's helpful to relieve myself from feeling guilt or feeling anger towards myself. But I will say being in public health is extremely frustrating, which I'm sure, all of us, we can talk a little bit more about that. But when you are constantly up against it and being faced with your, issues that are personal to you every single day, when you're showing up in public health to talk about these issues that you've personally been impacted by, that your friends and family and communities that you're close with, that your accomplices with, that they're experiencing every single day, and you're sitting here talking about it, intellectualizing the lived experience that we feel every single day. It's very exhausting. And then you're going to a lot of white-led organizations, philanthropic organizations, and government, and killing yourself to get some chump change to try to work to address these issues. It's always exhausting. So that one tool that I found really helpful lately, of just acknowledging if I feel guilt or not enoughness or whatever, that is the result of these systems and it's not mine. It allows me to at least put it to the side. So that's where I'm at on my journey.
Thank you, Christine and Natasha. So during my second year of medical school, I became really sick, and my condition was able to progress to really severe disease, ironically, as a result of provider bias and medical racism. And at the time, I was so busy believing that I was drowning in medical school to notice that my actual real life was being threatened, and I was getting really, really sick. And when that reckoning did come for me, it hit very hard. And I was studying and treading water in medical school, truly right up to the day before I went in for major abdominal surgery. And I spent the next year recovering as much of my health as I could, which unfortunately is not going to be all of it. Although in other ways, I'm healthier probably now than I've ever been. But with all that, I looked back at medical school and I thought, why? And I haven't really ever, that was really the start of it. And I haven't been able to stop asking that question, I guess. And at the same time that I was being a medical student, I was doing really exceptional, high-powered diversity and inclusion work, equity work, and I was just like constantly fighting because that work never ends. And I knew that if I stopped or if I let up a little bit, then we could lose headway and our window of opportunity would close and the systems would start to pull back in and close back in. And the really incredible thing, I guess, about getting sick and being pulled so drastically out of all of this was that it granted me perspective of it. And I was able to observe this medical system. And what I saw is this really ugly monster of a machine that is a collection of mechanisms and many parts, and altogether is greater than the sum of its parts. And that the pressure that I was feeling was the weight of that system, and the pressure and race that I was in my diversity work was, again, like directly and indirectly pressure from the system, which was on me for no other reason that it is within its function to do that. And the work never ends because it is constantly recreated. And the other attribute or skill, however we want to put it, that I feel like I gained out of this whole experience and getting sick is the ability to reorient myself to reality. And I think this is probably something that anybody, who's recovered from trauma or abuse or has a chronic invisible illness would understand, that just because the majority of people agree on something does not make it true. And that can be a really hard thing to have to be constantly orienting yourself to. And it's hard work. It's like every single day I'm getting up and I'm having to remind myself, like, I am not crazy. So Christine, your origin story really resonates with me, and like having to remind myself, I am not crazy. I trust myself. I believe myself. And being aware that when we're in a system, we're not going to be able to have as much perspective on it as we maybe wish we could or would like to. We're just never going to have a full perspective of it. And so I think that is a really important part of being aware. Well, that awareness is a very important first step in liberation or in personal sovereignty, and then in collective sovereignty. And yeah, so that's the origin story of where it really started off for me. And it's honestly grown from there. And I just continue asking why. And a lot of time that's where it kind of starts to fall apart, the system and the constructs that we're dealing with.
Well, thank you all for sharing. I am definitely taking some of these skills, lessons that you all have, and definitely feel like my heart portal open and like, dang, okay, I have, oh, sorry, but I have some work to do or some ways to hold some of this weight differently. So thank you. Some of you alluded to this or spoke on this directly, but our next question is, why is a conversation on Black liberation, Indigenous sovereignty, and the intersectionality of these ways of being important, especially as it relates to health? And anyone can start.
I think it's really important that we are having this discussion because there's the similarities, not just in the impact of, white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, and all of these systems that really, these violent systems that really put us to the place that we are now through slavery and genocide. It's not just about the harms, it's also about the solutions, very similar. Obviously, when we're talking about Black liberation, I mean, African Americans are Indigenous people that have been displaced because through kidnapping and enslavement. And it's this idea of, speaking specifically about slavery and this being overworked and no rest. And, it's this idea of you can become disconnected with the inherent knowing of the way to resolve these issues or to come back to yourself or whatever. And it's just a very similar solution oriented being that we all have. It's today, in public health, it's that same as like what's not measured doesn't matter. Or, you have to have an audit of 10 years of a police department to, say conclusively that the ex-police department, has a significant history of targeting Black and Indigenous people in a jurisdiction. And it's like, yeah, we can share a lived experience to acknowledge that, but then you have to intellectualize and have an academic study to show that, just because, when it comes to the way that policymaking works and the way that academics works, that's what it is. But I think it's this idea of using the inherent knowing that our ancestors have used, and really we have, if we are able to access that part of ourselves, to guide us and to navigate the world that we live in. I think a lot of times when people hear, the words like Black liberation or decolonization, because it's unfamiliar, because it's not just a part of the traditional narrative, and a lot of the time, like a lot of us aren't raised talking about that, depending on, obviously how you grew up. It seems like you can't envision what that means, or it's too much of a foreign concept to you, and that if you choose to decolonize your mind and your spirit and your way of living in the world, it means that you are going to completely have to go off the grid and live somewhere completely away from everyone, and review or reject all of the things that our modern world has to offer. But people who are committed to decolonization, people who are committed to Black liberation, are not realists. We're not. One of the unfortunate realities of being Black, of being Indigenous, of being marginalized in other ways, is that you are acutely aware of how this world works, and very much a realist just in your survival. And so to act as though that's like not, those two things can't exist is not, that's not actually how it works. And so I just think having more conversations about what that could look like, and how that could show up, it makes it feel a little bit more realistic. It makes it feel a little less like, I don't think there's anything wrong with radical movement, radical discussion, but for some people that's scary because it's too much for them, and it obviously can be traumatizing and triggering. But it's really important to have these discussions, because we have to start to envision a world in which we move differently, and then we have different results. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about that, because we have these shared inherent ways about working towards solution and envisioning solution.
Yeah, all of that. The only other two things I would add are, one is just like that meditation that we had this morning, or at the beginning of this session, about water, is that we're all connected, right? And so I know there was a quote, I was trying to find it, but some of y'all may know it, but just understanding the reality that our liberation is tied up together. And so that the liberation and sovereignty of Black and Indigenous people means liberation and sovereignty for everyone else. If we're not around, it's going to be someone else, right? And so it's just, there's a mindset, there's a core about power and control that's underneath all of this. And really understanding what that core is, and understanding the opposite of that is the sharing and the generosity and the connectedness. The other piece is a little bit more practical, and that's everybody's talking about it, so then actually do it, right? There's a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. It says, "Your actions speak so loud, I can't even hear what you're saying." And as a person that's worked in government and in equity work with systems for about 15 years, I've seen billions of dollars be passed through just in the state of Minnesota around addressing equity, specifically for African American and American Indian people, because we have the highest rates of disparities in Minnesota. So let's just be about it. If we're going to talk about it, let's be about it.
Yeah, and I would just, also add in the reminder that BIPOC is not synonymous with minority. Black, Indigenous, people of color are by and large the majority. And the idea that all colonized people have something in common, even if it is just the fact that we're being colonized and impacted by it, that in and of itself is enough to be completely poisonous to colonization as a process, as a system. And I'd also add in the reminder that colonization is by design intended to break us down collectively and individually, and to replace. And so everything that colonization adds, it does as a replacement for something that is already existing and already whole. And the mechanisms for how our different communities are colonized, the experiences are different, but the consequences and the function of colonization is the same. And so Christine kind of already said this, but what colonizes some of us is what colonizes all of us. What allows for Indigenous sovereignty is the same that allows for Black liberation. And so these are the same thing. And it's not saying that people are the same or our communities are the same, of course. We are all so rich in our diversity and in our cultures. But what is happening in colonization and decolonization, that's the same. And the more that we can talk about these in the same way, which really should be the easiest way to do it, the more impactful we can be. And we also talked about data genocide in terms of disease burden, but it's also very, very present in our access to our identity and to our history, demographics that is collected as data. And so that's our access to who we are and to where we come from and to our stories. And so coming back to, if colonization is seeking to replace, it is giving us a narrative that we did not create. And so it's hard to fully really imagine or envision what it would be, what something would be if it wasn't replaced. But it's enough just to know that colonization is there and that this is something that has happened and that it is impacting us individually, impacting our communities. And there are very, very concrete reasons that the colonial powers would want to keep us separate. And yeah, that really should be, I feel, enough to bring us together.
Wow, just, again, taking all of that wisdom that you all just shared and the importance and really being about the work, and bringing ourselves, forward and how we do and thinking about, our ways have been here, since time immemorial, and still carrying, those teachings and the wisdom to this work that we do and understanding our true selves. And I think, this really leads us into our next question, thinking about the meditation, thinking about all of those components. What are some health practices, healing traditions, or even healing perspectives that strengthen Black and Native communities, especially as we're revitalizing and reclaiming our health, which you all have alluded to this morning? What are those practices that continue? Because obviously, like the fact that we're still here, right? They tried really hard for us all to not be here, but we're here, we're talking, dropping knowledge, and just the words that you have been sharing is so powerful. So if we can have you elaborate a little bit more on some of those perspectives.
Oh, I just want to jump on this one because I love that question. I love that question. I feel like, so we, just like as I shared in my own story, as a person that is of African descent, my ancestors were enslaved. I don't know what tribe that they came from. I don't know what language they spoke. I don't know what traditions they had. As a person who was impacted by the Indian Child Removal Act, and my mother was taken from her, not only from her family, but from her community and raised by a Norwegian family. And so through the prayers of my grandma and through prayers probably of other relatives, I have found my way back to those teachings and to that, to my community and to literally my relatives. And that's a very powerful thing. I believe that power is so much stronger than this Western construct, that many of us have these inclinations within us. We have these callings within us, these feelings, these senses, these other ways of knowing within us that we're drawn to. And because of the way that the system's designed, like myself, the children and people that are starting to feel those things get shut down, right? Because it might look weird, it might look out of the norm, it might look out of the box. I want to step aside, just like in Tegan's story about like, what's just because the majority feels that way doesn't mean that it's right, right? A lot of our kids, all of our kids are born as geniuses, right? They have all this information, all these ways of knowing, and are reacting and responding to the environments around them in very genius ways. And the way that our system and construct is designed has not ever been in our best interest, right? That is something we know. And that system punishes a lot of times our children and teaches them that what naturally, your natural response is bad, it is wrong, it is not acceptable, it's not okay. So those natural healing ways that we have intuitively within us get shut down and stifled from the very beginning. A lot of times it's then reinforced when we go back home because of that internalized oppression that our relatives, our parents and our caregivers have. And so when they see us wanting to move our bodies a lot, or when we want to sing, or we want to play outside in the dirt, or things that we are now learning from science actually helps us heal, our parents were taught like, we can't do these things, we don't do these things, sit still, stop singing, be quiet, don't get dirty, right? Like we were taught those things so we could fit into these boxes. And I really, you know, I've had many of these conversations with people from Black community, you know, just talking about, well, you know, you're Native, so you can just go learn your language, you can go back to your community. Man, I feel like that the epigenetics, you know, is one language, one way of using that, but the prayers and that power of our ancestors is in us. It can't be killed, it can't be destroyed, it's still there. And we have it. If we could just tap into that, just little by little, we start strengthening that muscle, that spiritual muscle, that emotional muscle, and then we start getting even more information downloaded into our spirits and into our bodies about what that next thing is to do. And then things externally start to affirm that you're on the right path. I'm speaking from my own personal experience that I've seen that, and I've had many relatives, many people I've encountered have the same thing. So every single thing that we need is within us. We can tap into it, we can trust it, and it'll be reinforced around us.
Yeah, I just have a little bit to add, but I want to share some wisdom from one of my mentors who I really look up to, Dr. Ayanna Jordan, who is constantly reminding that preservation, self-preservation, is active resistance. Taking care of yourself, protecting yourself, keeping yourself healthy and well, that is a very, very powerful form of activism. Because like I said earlier, colonialism and colonization, that is a process for trying to break us down so that things can be replaced and that we can eventually be erased. And so protecting yourself, preserving yourself, your body, your spirit, your connections, your culture, preserving whatever it is that you currently have, that is a very, very, very powerful thing. And that's something that all of us can do. And like I said, with my example for my origin story of getting sick and having to step back from medical school, I mean, that was really putting that into action, is that self-preservation. And what I found is that that really is the path of least resistance.
And I would just say that, you know, at the Center for Black Health and Equity, one of the things that is just a core of the work that we do and is vital to Black health and Black liberation is community, is culture, is family. You know, having connection and sharing experience is really, really important. Obviously, it's a part of, you know, feeling as though you're not alone, strength in numbers, all of these things. I just also wanted to say that obviously there's a lot of diversity in the Black community about what faith means. And I think, you know, there is a lot to be said about what that means and how that's healing for different members, you know, whether you are religious or not, if you are spiritual or not. I'll say for myself, I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not religious for a variety of reasons. For me, everything that Tegan and Christine mentioned is the ancestry connection is really, really important. And I find that through nature. And I think a lot of African Americans are, you know, talking about the fact that it's really, really unfortunate that systemic racism has created these barriers that have had influence in creating these stereotypes, like, you know, Black people don't swim, but, you know, it's like Black people don't go out in nature, they don't hike, they don't, you know, do this, do that. And so it's a real disconnect from what we know to be true about ourselves and, you know, this inherent knowledge and connection and relationship we have with the earth, the disconnection that has been caused by anti-Blackness and slavery and everything in between. And so to me, I think it's really important that we are encouraging Black people to get out into nature and to connect with it, because there is, I think, something that is fueled by that connection that Christine was talking about, to reconnect you with your ancestry. I think that's very, very important. And so I'll say faith, because truly, you know, in order to, you know, when James Baldwin said to be Black in this society is to, you know, feel this insanity, to be awake, and to be Black is to feel insanity. And so this idea of faith, that there's something, that you're a part, not only are you a part of something bigger, but that there is a bigger plan at hand, is very, very important. And regardless of how people engage in that and how that comes into your life and your beliefs, I am fully respectful of that. You know, so for me, just acknowledging that faith and family, community, and then also ancestry is really, really important for these non-traditional ways of improving our health.
I want to add one more thing too, if that's okay, Coco. Okay. I also just wanted to add, since we're talking in this question about health practices and health disparities, and I have to put in the piece that we all should try to keep in mind that when we're talking about health and we're talking about illnesses or diagnoses, that the way that those are constructed, the way that those are framed is really significant. So I have ADHD, and I'm sure a lot of people on here either have ADHD or have a child or loved one with ADHD. And what we hear about that, if we were to just distill it down, is that it's difficulty focusing, and or maybe difficulty sitting still. What we don't hear about it are the differences in ADHD that are actually very beneficial, or that lead to very exceptional sort of things. For example, if you told me to find a needle in a haystack and you checked back in 2 weeks, I probably would not have found it. But if you tell me to find a needle in a haystack and you give me an hour to do it, and you tell me that the fate of the world rests on it, I will find the needle, and then I will sew a rug or something out of all the hay, like this exceptional thing. And that wasn't something that I never heard anything about the, you know, these are the sort of superpower pieces. It's always a matter of, okay, there's issues with executive functioning, there's issues with sitting still. I'm in medical school. I'm not really aware of any huge issues with executive functioning that are have really had a big negative impact on my life. However, I am aware that some of the differences in my executive functioning allow me to have a level of creativity that a lot of people don't have, or to bring that into my research and translate that into innovation, or being able to conceptually tie things together across very wide disciplines. That's the kind of thing that, I mean, that's just a very different sort of framing for ADHD, and that's just one example. And we could really apply that to any number of conditions. And so I think keeping that in mind when we are talking about what we're dealing with or what our loved ones are dealing with, what our communities are dealing with, it can sometimes be really difficult not to feel overwhelmed or hopeless in that. But there always is a different framing.
Each of these pieces has been super helpful, especially with the framing piece, I think, because as you know, ACAF runs many social media awareness campaigns, all of that. And I'm like, how do we expand conversation so that our relatives can kind of reclaim or be optimistic about some of these skills that haven't been framed as skills in this colonized society that we're living in? So how can we, revitalize that? I'm very excited about this. And so it's actually kind of related to this next question, which is based on the topic of like, how can we develop together and what have we developed together, or what are some opportunities for us? So there are so many possibilities for collaboration between Black and Native communities as well as other accomplices. So what are projects in your life that you are excited about celebrating and that you're interested in having others get involved with?
I'll just say that the work that I'm doing right now, I think when we talk about public health, we talk about cancer prevention, we talk about health equity. So often we're just talking about that specific thing, or that, the specific type of disease that we're trying to prevent, or the specific type of health outcomes or causes of health conditions. And I think that we still need to work on that. I'm not, rejecting that. But what I'm also have been talking about for a really long time is that we need to also incorporate these deep-rooted causes of these issues, which we all are aware of, that, systemic racism is obviously a huge umbrella. And so to have that as the umbrella under which we work is good, but then also we need to start identifying those components of the system and trying to, disrupt that. Now, there's a whole other question about whether we can amend the system to actually make something that will lead to, Native sovereignty, Black liberation in this world that we see. That's a whole other question. But for what we're doing right now, I'm really excited to start to work in public health that looks, doesn't look like public health. It's like, I want to work on infrastructure. We have this huge opportunity. There is, unfortunately, the last couple of years have revealed all of the things that we already knew about, health disparities and poor infrastructure that really, especially and significantly disparately impacts Black and Native communities across the country. So to me, the idea that now the government, the federal government, state governments, local governments, are now turning their attention to rebuilding the existing infrastructure so that we can respond in a better way to pandemics that come in the future. The pandemic that we are still currently in, that are still disparately, seriously impacting Black and Brown communities. We really have an opportunity here to recreate some of the systemic components of racism, because infrastructure is a huge component of that. And so I'm really excited about trying to get public health people into the infrastructure discussion, talking about our systems, our utilities, our physical infrastructure, roads and bridges, because what happened before, back in the mid 20th century, is they started building freeways and highways and roads and all of these things, destroying communities. I'm working right now on this very issue, working in Black neighborhoods that were destroyed all across the country because of the development of these major freeways and highways, and what they look like now. And now that there's this opportunity to reinvest this major infrastructure money, whereas we can't get a major bill passed to address, racial equity in this country, we need to start using these types of investments that go by another name and just treat them as, reparations, and treat them as, ways to really reallocate the funding that's not going to tribes. And, these are things that we say we are going to claim this as what we think should already be happening, and they can call it whatever they want. But so I think this discussion about, infrastructure is really, really exciting to me, just because it gives us the opportunity to take health and these social, economic, and environmental issues and put them together. And it's a real opportunity for intersectional policy change. We're going to reimagine how we can rebuild bridges, or how we can, stimulate economies. How can we do that in a way that is not harmful, but actually reparative to the environment, that creates more green spaces, that gives tribal sovereignty, and that allows for Black liberation because it's community centered, and you're advocating for the distribution of these resources in a way that they don't traditionally get distributed. And it also gives us an opportunity to take those who, were saying Black Lives Matter, that were calling out all these health inequities that we saw from COVID, really, really talking the talk, or as Christine said, that quote by Emerson, like, you are doing so much, I can't hear what you're saying. It's an opportunity for us to say, okay, if you're about that, then use it to apply it when you've got this huge chunk of change that you haven't seen for 60 years in your county, city, whatever. Are you working with the tribes? Are you working with communities? You have any relationships with any Black and brown communities in your area? Those are the conversations that can spring from that. So to me, infrastructure is something that I'm really excited about, and I think can really advance health equity and also advance Black liberation and tribal sovereignty.
Yes, I love that. I would add just like working on our own decolonization, because I think, my co-panelists had talked about being within systems, and that the white supremacy constructs really, kind of reinforcing and rewarding running ourselves ragged, and being perfectionists, and putting all of our energy and effort into maintaining that image and that facade that actually deteriorates us from within, because it's like, you're not worthy, you're not good enough. And so therefore, and I had a similar experience to that. And it was through my own experience of realizing like I was dying, like I was allowing this to kill me, not literally, not as literally with a disease, thank God, but just kind of spiritually and emotionally. For me, that has always been my area of challenge. And through learn that even after, being 18, speeding up to my mid 30s, working for the government, and just really having to decolonize within the systems and doing things a different way. It's really difficult because you become isolated, your own peers, there's lateral stuff, because we are, especially for Black folks, but Native as well, but just the terror and fear that we carry within our bodies around white folks and white people's discomfort. I was experiencing a lot of lateral stuff within the organizations that I was in as I was trying to decolonize for myself. And it was inadvertently impacting the lens that I had and how I talked about the work that we were doing. And that was disrupting things, even for my peers who were feeling a sense of safety within the construct, right? Because they had learned how to move within it. But as I started to continue to evolve in my work and didn't give up on that path and continued to work on decolonizing, it's a lifelong journey, more information was given to me and more understanding. And so being able to see the trauma that many white folks carry and mask in socially acceptable ways within these systems, like perfectionism. I mean, a lot of the characteristics that are norms within organizations and are acceptable and rewarded are maladaptive, socially acceptable trauma responses, right? And so, we just kind of all adhere to that. And it's no, wait a minute, y'all are in trauma response. Why are we trying to mold to that? And so as I started to understand that, what's the opposite of trauma? Healing. So how can I bring that in, not just within myself, but how can I then start to translate that into the spaces that I'm in and really use a trauma-informed lens, for lack of a better term, within systems and organizations that I'm working within. And I started to see a whole different response from people. It was less of this friction of me trying to, you know, take things away from people, of like, stop being racist, stop being this and stop being that, but more giving to them. Like, let's talk about healing. Let's talk about abundance. Let's talk about belonging and generosity. And that started to work better, because then people don't feel like they have to give anything up, rather that they can add these things. And so that's how I've always tended to work, is from within the systems, within myself, and then within the system that I'm working in, rather than coming from the outside and looking for these external outcomes, which are very needed, but we need both, right? We need also to be working within these systems, transforming the human beings, the human bodies that work within these systems, and challenging them from moving to this intellectualization of the things that we're talking about, to the embodiment. What does this actually mean? You're uncomfortable. And anytime we try something new and we do new things, it's going to make us uncomfortable, but that's how we grow. You're not unsafe. It makes you feel like you're not safe. You're safe. You're just uncomfortable. And how do you distinguish between those two things is what I would have to add.
So one thing I really love about the word decolonization is that it is de and colonization. So it's honestly, I mean, at least with my lens, as easy as just saying no thank you to colonization. And the really hard part is getting perspective on where colonization is, what it is impacting, and all the downstream effects of it, which are, I mean, innumerable. And, you know, I think a lot of times when we talk about decolonization, we talk about it philosophically or conceptually in a way that can be hard to grasp, and hard to really see how it applies and fits in our everyday lives. And so a lot of my work right now is centered around decolonization as something that is accessible and actionable. And I have a method that I'm calling functional decolonization, and I'm really passionate right now about teaching it and helping people just bring that into their lives and their work, especially in research and in academia. And the starting point of it that I want to leave with everybody here is asking that really essential question, which is why? And even with things that you wouldn't necessarily think, it's easier when you're asking it about something that already doesn't feel right, when you can already feel like you're the, you know, square peg trying to be shoved into a round hole. Like, why do I actually have to fit into this hole? And it gets a little bit more tricky when we're doing it around things that we just don't think to question. And there's these hidden processes and these mechanisms that are just constantly going on with us, through us, and around us. And I think really the only way to start to get down to those is to just be more and more often asking why. Why does it have to be this way? And when you get down to that point where you can't find a satisfactory answer, that's the really critical point for how we start to decolonize. And if anybody listening wants to talk about decolonization or functional decolonization, I'm always excited to talk about it. So you can get in touch.
Well, I know we're getting near the end, so I want to see if I know we have one last question, and I know that we sent them to you, but I think I might want to rephrase it and ask you, what is in the creation story of Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty that we're living in? And you can answer this like a myriad of ways. What does it look like, feel like, taste like, smell like, all of that to you? Like, what would the physical manifestation of it be, and what is it currently for you?
Water. I can jump right into that. Water. Amazing and vast and everything and everywhere and changing, dynamic, fluid, impossible to hold or encapsulate. And through all of us.
I mean, I think right now, I think it's obviously when it comes to like dreaming of what that looks like. I could go on about that. I've always been a very imaginative, dreaming person. I think very much connected to my ancestors in that way. And so to me, it's about, the lack of collective suffering, the healing of ancestral wounds, those types of things are things that I think of, because it's very painful when you are not only experiencing the pain from these colonial systems that are so violent and harmful in our current existence, and then also carrying that from your ancestors. So the healing of those things, in your life and in lives that have come before you. And then obviously having an earth that is cared for, and we have a mutually respectful, reciprocal relationship with the earth, and that all people are respected and understood in our own unique ways and skills and abilities. And I think we touched on all of those things today in many different ways. So what that could look like in a post colonial world, that I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I do know that there's a lot of room for healing and repair. So I'll say that. And then I just want to speak about what that looks like right now in the war that we're currently in. I really am loving, I love the NAP ministry, and this idea of taking Black liberation for yourself in this moment and saying, like Tegan said, like, no, rest is resistance. This idea of really claiming that for yourself. I mean, it's very difficult because, obviously, it's hard. You have to survive. Sometimes, especially if you're trying to advance equity and you're trying to advance health and all the work that we're in, you really want to, throw yourself into it so you can maybe even use the tools that are used to harm you against others. And so I think it just depends on what feels right to you, who you are. Some of us are healers, some of us are protectors, so we all have different roles that we're here to play. And so I think it looks different, but in general, I do think the idea of acknowledging, like Tegan said, and then also acknowledging what's at play here and not taking on any additional burden is easier said than done. But I think the acknowledgement is a huge part. And then I also want to say that I think one way in which those who have privilege and power can support, Native sovereignty and Black liberation, especially if you have authority and power in public health and government and public interest, whatever, trust-based giving, like, it is so ridiculous how difficult it is to do the work that we do. I mean, it's like causes the harm that we're trying to repair with BIPOC public health workers and policymakers and all of this stuff. So, this idea of making it less difficult, and part of that is a rejection. Obviously, I don't want to apply for any federal grants. I don't want to apply for any state funding. I don't want to do any of those things. I want to lay down. I want to go sit outside. I don't want to do this. I don't want to talk about, death and disease and that I'm seeing in my own life. Like, I don't want to do that, but I feel called to it. I'm doing it. So for those who have any influence in trying to make that easier, that is what you can just understand. That to me is really respecting the sovereignty of Native people, of tribes, really ensuring that you are not overburdening people with reporting and making sure that the work that communities do is legitimate. All of that nonsense is just really harmful. And so to me, if we can push for that, if we can bring that up, if we can acknowledge at least we're doing it, but we don't like it, but we're choosing to do it because whatever, at least it will empower us. So to me, that's what liberation and sovereignty looks like in the world that we're in right now. So I think that's important to acknowledge, because who knows how, I know eventually we will get there. I do believe that at the end of the day, we will win. It's just, I don't know what's going to have to happen until that happens. So, that's what I got to say about right now.
I love how Natasha always brings it to the super practical. She was like, reporting. Yes, I'm so here for that. I love it. So yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that was coming up for me, I was just, listening to them and thinking, and just thinking about being able to be safe, and like what safety means, like physically and psychologically, like to have physical and psychological safety in your body, which we don't have now, and our relatives haven't had for a long time, and how we've adapted our cultures and our personalities kind of around lack of having safety, lack of having access to our basic needs being met, and the things that we brilliantly do to adapt and to survive. I mean, brilliance that our ancestors and our relatives continue to do because we do not have physical, psychological safety and access to our basic needs being met. And unfortunately, that's where we're at. I think if we could start there, if we could start with our basic needs, people having access to their basic needs being met, food, water, housing, and having psychological and physical safety. I think, to me, that would be the what could come out of that, like all of the energy that we use for those things right now, like what all that energy could be then used for, right? The creative, the healing things that all of that energy could then be used for if we didn't have to dedicate so much of our energy to surviving. That would be what I would envision.
I just wanted to add to that. I think it's Audre Lorde, and I'm so sorry, I should know this, but the quote is that, racism is a distraction. And I think that's exactly what Christine is referring to here. It's like when it's so hard to survive, let alone thrive. It's, it's really difficult for you to actually, not that you're not aware of it, but it's really hard to actually, do what you can do to get out of it or whatever. But acknowledging the resiliency that we have seen, the art that is created, the movement. I mean, there's so much that is that's already coming out even of the struggle. But it would be incredible. I can't wait for the day where that does happen, Christine, where those things are not oppressing and suppressing the brilliance and the talent and all of that is lost from the trauma and the violence and the oppression. That it's mind-blowing to think about it, and also very, very sad.
And I feel like my little last piece really ties in with all of it. And that's, again, to listen to yourself and to trust yourself. And orienting ourselves is not always a straightforward or easy thing to do. And for me, it's really important to have people that I can look to help me orient when I feel like I'm not able to do that. And it's okay to feel like you need to do that all the time, and to remind yourself, and to, look in the mirror every morning if you need to and say, I believe myself, like I trust myself. And with the story I told about getting sick and having to step back from everything, I mean, not having to step back, it wasn't a choice. Getting pulled out of everything. I mean, a huge piece of that, and the fact that I was able to continue on as far as I did with my disease progressing the way that it did, because I was being gaslit by so many forces. And that is so powerful, and that dissonance was so powerful that I was so strongly dissociated that that's where things were at. And that is a place where most of us, I think, are functioning all the time. You know, even if we're not physically sick, that's a place that, and you know, many of us are, and that's a place that that we're functioning at, yeah, probably all or most of the time. And being able to check in with yourself, and even if something is just not sitting right, and recognizing dissonance or recognizing something feeling wrong, even if you can't wrap your head around it, that's important. And that's very, very powerful work to be doing, just having that awareness.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to bring it back to some of the work that we do here at ACAF, is that our Cancer Survivors Leadership Advisory Council will tell you very much exactly what you just said, is listen to your bodies. You know it best, and you have the opportunity to advocate for yourself and find those ways to support yourself further. I know we're at time, and I am so thankful to Christine, Natasha, Tegan, to Coco and Melissa, Sana, Mata, all who have been involved in making this happen, as well as to all of the participants and our relatives, our ancestors that are in the space with us, to the earth that we're all living in this beautiful universe. I'm just so excited and energized to see what comes of the conversation, and want to remind everyone that next week we have another webinar that will focus more on the health and healthcare pieces. Tegan will be joining us again, and we'll have other speakers as well. So you can join us next week. We also have a resources list that we will be mailing out to participants, and can certainly send the link for the recording, as well as the few slides that we did share. We do have an evaluation that would be really helpful for everyone to share, if possible. And then lastly, with all of this, I just want to invite everyone to breathe and to visualize for yourself what Black liberation, Indigenous sovereignty means. So as I ask the panelists, what does it look, feel, smell, touch, taste, all of that like to you? And how can we make sure that this is happening both in our current reality and for the 7 generations, next generations to come? So, Miigwech, thank you all so much.